Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. I wanted to do a video relating to the current horrendous invasion of Ukraine by Putin. Specifically, I wanted to understand how history has informed the invasion, how the historical roots of the conflict. So I thought I'd start with a video on the history of Ukraine. So this is by the Suibhne channel, something like that. I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation, but it is called the Animated History of Ukraine. It sounds really interesting because Ukraine is a country with a fascinating and often deeply tragic history. I mean, its origins can be traced back to the Kievan Rus, who were kind of Scandinavian, sort of Slavic Vikings almost. They had their origins in Scandinavian raiders. And is anything cooler than a Slavic Viking? Russia also has its origins in the Kievan Rus, and this becomes quite pertinent because, according to Putin and people like Dmitry Medvedev, who is or was the former Russian president, former Russian prime minister, basically a Putin puppet, they don't regard Ukraine as a proper country. Now, obviously, Ukrainians strongly and violently disagree, as we're seeing right now. So there's a lot of history tied up in what's currently happening. Obviously, eventually Ukraine was, well, first of all, conquered by Mongols, incorporated, eventually conquered by the Russian Empire. Tried to become independent shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, but was crushed in the Russian Civil War. Finally became independent in 1991, I think, after a revolution. There was a referendum following the fall of the USSR. And its more recent history has been kind of a struggle between those who wanted to look west and those who wanted to look east towards Russia and towards the EU, NATO, respectively. I think the EU, NATO side of the argument definitely seems to have won. Hence, Russian tanks are trying to invalidate that argument by force. So I think there's a lot to learn. I think it was really interesting. If you're from Ukraine, you have my utmost sympathy. I'm really sorry. If you're watching Putin, please stop. Don't be a dick. Imagine if that works. Imagine if he was watching. It's pretty unlikely, but it's worth a go. But yes, I hope you find it interesting.
The Samurai Limited Edition pin is available now. Hurry and order yours now before they run out. Or
Looks
get
good.
one for free by signing up at Patreon like all of these nice people. This episode is...
So, of course, the link to the original video will be in the description. Go give the channel some love, some support, subscribe, etc. I don't want to be a total vulture on their content.
Supported by Raycon, a wireless earbud company co-founded by Ray J and many other titans of the music industry at about half the price of the leading premium brands. Head to buyraycon.com/SUIBHNE to get a further 15% off your order, which will also help support this channel.
Yeah, go do that, but wait for the video to finish first.
Ukrainian identity long precedes the formation of any nation-state on this soil.
Sure.
The modern geopolitical entity and the current Ukrainian crisis can all trace their roots back to the land.
It's worth saying this video is from 2020, so when they say the current Ukraine crisis, they're kind of referring to the partial Russian invasion of 2014 and its aftermath, not to the more complete Russian invasion of 2022, which is still going on.
And unique geography, and some of Europe's most fascinating cultures. An identity that has its foundations in no less than 3 geographic features.
Okay.
Eurasian steppes, the Dnieper River, and of course, the Black Sea. These 3 very important parts of Ukraine.
It's fascinating how geography affects national identity. It's something I've always been very interested in. Kind of, to what extent do countries emerge in the way they do emerge because of geographical features? I mean, quite a lot, I think, certainly in some cases.
Not only shape its culture and identity, but have also made Ukraine a pawn in the strategic and economic games of larger powers, especially between Russia and the West.
Yeah.
During the centuries of Russian hegemony, this was less of a problem. Monarchs and autocrats don't really care much for identity politics after all. But post-independence, the centuries of influence from outside powers have started to show. But Ukraine has its own nationhood and a story that goes all the way back to the migration of nomads through the Pontic-Caspian steppe.
This is a really cool intro. I need something like this for my channel. I mean, it's slightly beyond my editing capabilities. Viking longship.
Well, it's been a long time coming, the remake of my old Ukraine video. Let's see if I can get it right this time. Now I know what you're thinking. Doesn't Ukraine's history begin with the Slavic migrations?
Sure.
And the answer is Kind of, yes, but the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppes are inseparable from Ukraine's early development. A steppe, in geographic terms, if you're not aware, lends itself almost exclusively to the development of nomadic societies. They lack geographic boundaries for defense, materials for building, and the grazing patterns of animals mean that, well, you go where the food goes. This is one of the reasons why the horse was domesticated in the steppes. It made travel and hunting easier, and facilitated the raiding of rival tribes. And if a horde got big enough, it might start raiding, say, the crumbling Roman Empire. Hordes of Alans, Huns, Avars...
So the kind of the steppe, which extended all the way from Eastern Europe to Mongolia, almost to China, plays such a huge role in the politics of medieval Europe and medieval China, and indeed ancient Europe and ancient China. So for more than 1,000 years, the kind of the settled civilizations of Western and Mediterranean Europe and of China were constantly threatened by various nomadic civilizations. So I mean the Huns, the Cumans, the Mongols, the Scythians. There were a whole bunch of them at various different time periods, and it wasn't really until kind of the 17th, 18th century when firearms gave the sedentary peoples, the settled people, such a big advantage over the nomads, that this problem was finally erased, and that had a huge impact on world politics. So yeah, for say, I mean, well over 1,000 years, kind of being raided by nomadic invaders was just a way of life for both West Europeans and Chinese.
Bulgars and Khazars had passed through this area on their way to the rich lands of Rome, and each had left a massive influence on the Slavs and directly caused their migrations in the first place. Okay. If you think about it, the only place being worse than Rome would have been like anything on the way to Rome. Next is our...
I mean, that's very true. So a lot of the kind of the people, the so-called barbarian peoples who brought down the Roman Empire, were actually pushed into them by other similar nations. So, for example, the Goths, which did huge damage to the Eastern Roman Empire, were pushed there because they were running away from the Huns, or because the Huns would later attack both the Eastern and Western Roman empires themselves. It's kind of interesting how, I mean, the Huns are so scary that even the Goths were running away from them. But there's like this chain reaction of one group running away hits Rome, and another group, and another group, and another group, and so on.
Second geographic feature, the Dnieper River, which means we get to talk about Vikings.
Hey!
Now, the lands of the Slavs, you see, were pretty irresistible to the Swedish Vikings. No centralized control, tons of wealth to raid and trade for, and hundreds of miles of long navigable rivers through it all. At the end of which lies the jackpot itself, Constantinople.
Yes.
It wasn't long before...
So it's crazy just how much influence the Vikings had on so many different areas in Europe, and indeed beyond Europe. So, of course, so what is now Ukraine, the British Isles, France, Iceland. But I mean, even as far as Constantinople, so the Varangian Guard, which was the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard, was largely made up of Viking volunteers or Viking mercenaries. And it's kind of like the Praetorian Guard, except it killed a lot less emperors than the Praetorian Guard, which was the Roman Emperor's Guard, and they're famous mainly for killing emperors. So yeah, it's really interesting how far their influence extended.
Well, these Norsemen, who the Slavs called Rus, had built a huge trade empire centered on the Dnieper River, an old Khazar trading post called Kiev. Now, of course,
and so Kiev is a lot older as a city than Moscow. I mean, to some extent, both modern Russia and or modern Russian nationalists still look at Kiev as kind of the birthplace of their nation, which is part of why it's such an emotive issue for Russian nationalists, and part of why they're so keen to deny Ukrainian statehood.
The Slavs did eventually expel the Vikings from their land, but then quite ironically, politely asked them to return and rule them, which began the medieval state known as the Kievan Rus.
Imagine inviting Vikings to come and rule you.
Try and create some unity through religion. Prince Vladimir the Great sent envoys to all the neighbouring lands to study their various faiths, who reported that the Jews had lost Israel and therefore couldn't possibly be a blessed people.
Okay.
The Muslim Bulgars were sad and stinky. Their words, not mine, and also prohibited drinking, to which old Vlad here laughed, saying, drinking is the joy of the Rus, before finally settling...
Imagine telling Vikings not to drink. Like, what is there anything in history that would have been harder?
...on Christianity. to be specific, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, ostensibly because of how impressed his envoys were with the Hagia Sophia, but between you and me, I think they were just trying to suck it up to the Byzantines.
Yeah,
His
probably.
son, who had become known as Yaroslav the Wise, greatly expanded the prosperity of the Rus state with Ukraine's oldest body of codified laws. Although the Rus were pretty prosperous, they soon fragmented into regional rival city-states for two main reasons. One was the arrival of the Cumans, who took control of Crimea and severely handicapped their trade routes, and two was the decline of its most wealthy ally, Constantinople, thanks to a little event called the Fourth Crusade.
Yes.
You really can trace a lot of Europe's history to this event, huh?
So the Fourth Crusade has a good claim to be perhaps the biggest cock-up in military history, or one of, certainly. So Western Crusaders went through the Byzantine Empire to support the various Crusader kingdoms in kind of what is now Syria and Palestine. But on the way, they fell out with the Byzantines and sacked Constantinople. But I mean, destroyed large parts of the city, burnt it to the ground. And of course, Constantinople was a Christian city, albeit Orthodox rather than Catholic. And the weakening that this did to the Byzantine Empire would eventually lead to the Ottomans managing to kind of take over and take Constantinople, which was a disaster for Christendom. So yeah, it's crazy just how much the Fourth Crusade screwed up.
The increased infighting, the Rus cities were at their weakest point in decades, and so probably wouldn't deal very well with, say, a horde of more than 30,000 mounted archers from Mongolia.
That's true. Think they're coming.
Ooh, just their rotten luck.
Yes.
The part I want to focus on here, during an era called the Mongol-Tatar yoke, is not so much the rapid rise of the Golden Horde, which made the Rus its glorified cash cow through extortion, but rather its inevitable and arguably more important collapse. Because in what was the medieval Rus state, three regional powers would come to fill the Mongol vacuum, forever driving a wedge between the northeast and the southwest. Moscow would consolidate in the north, becoming the genesis of the Russian state, but for Ukraine, that genesis was in Lithuania.
Oh.
It's hard to conceptualize this today, but the Lithuanian state once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea.
So that is true, and they formed a union with Poland, but became a very, very powerful state for a long time, and then tragically collapsed, and they got partitions. But
later forming a union with Poland, absorbing swathes of those old Mongol Rus lands, which in Latin they called Ruthenia.
I mean, it's crazy to think there's like an alternative history in which, rather than kind of Moscow and the Russians becoming the great power of the East, it could very easily have been the Lithuanians.
This was the turning point for the lands of the Rus controlled by the West, diverging from those controlled by Moscow. Through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, what would become Ukraine had a direct line to Western philosophy and liturgy, with the Greek Catholic, or Uniate Church, flourishing in this period, whereas Moscow was isolated and inherited its autocratic rule from the Mongols. Even more so, symbolic.
So that's interesting. So you can see how kind of the cultural divergence between the Ukrainians and the Russians, both of whom had their origins in the Kievan Rus, began.
Moscow saw itself as the Third Rome, defender of the Orthodox faith.
So I mean, the word Tsar is actually means Caesar. That's where it comes from. I mean, the Russian imperial state modelled itself quite closely on Rome. It wasn't the only one, of course. I mean, the Byzantines did, although they had a much better claim to it. Holy Roman Empire did. I mean, quite a few places did.
Which further alienated it from the West. Then we have our third regional power, the Crimean Khanate, a rump state of the Mongol-influenced Cumans, whom the Slavs simply called Tatars. And here we get to talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of Ukrainian history. With the introduction of serfdom, a more severe form of feudalism, thousands of peasants fled.
And what's crazy is serfdom wasn't abolished until the late 19th century in Russia, across the Russian Empire. And it was essentially slavery. It was significantly worse than feudalism that you had in, say, England or France. Although that was bad enough, it was truly horrible.
The vast, open, sparsely populated frontiers to escape subjugation. Embracing their nomadic roots, living off the land free and fairly, they constructed a whole society with refugees, peasants, escaped serfs and slaves, Tatars, Ruthenians, Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims alike.
Sounds
they
cool.
would become perhaps the most important piece of Ukraine's identity. The Cossacks.
Oh, Cossacks, of course.
It's hard for me to overstate just how powerful the Cossacks became. Not only were they instrumental in leveraging their autonomy and powerful armies in service of the Polish crown, but they became inseparable from the idea of self-determination.
That's one of the a Polish wing hussar, one of the coolest looking military units in history. Oh yeah, Cossacks. Even to this day, there's still very big Cossack populations in both Russia and Ukraine, or kind of Cossack identifying populations. So it's really interesting how that group still exists.
The roots of Ukrainian ideas of independence were the Cossacks. And if they weren't treated the way they wanted to be, as equal autonomous partners, then they would be more than happy to fight on behalf of someone else. An opportunity they soon took during the Second Northern War.
Okay.
The Northern Wars were a long series of not altogether related events, but basically amounted to these four powers butting heads for more territory, especially over the Baltic Sea. But the part we're going to focus on is the Khmelnytsky uprising, and for this we have Joe from the channel Jabsy.
Ooh,
Although the
that's a
Cossacks
good
had
channel.
formed a close bond with the Commonwealth and had participated in numerous wars against the Turks and Tatars, the spirit of independence within their homeland, the Zaporizhian Siege, lived on. Tensions had reached a boiling point when King of Poland, John Casimir II, treated the siege with contempt and made efforts to curtail their autonomy, spurred by many local Cossack uprisings. When wars broke out between the empires of Russia, Sweden and Poland-Lithuania, the Cossacks took the opportunity to assert their independence and revolted under the leadership of Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, aligning themselves with Moscow. To this day, it is
So it's interesting that the Cossacks aligning with Moscow, because Cossacks would go on to perform a really important and very loyal part of the Russian army.
still unclear whether the treaty between the Tsar and the Cossacks aimed for further integration within the Russian Empire, or simply as a temporary military cooperation. But the Russian Empire's growth in the 18th century would ensure that Russia's interests would soon dominate.
Sure.
However, right bank Ukraine still remained loyal to the Commonwealth, and when the left bank Cossacks invaded Poland on the side of Russia, it set off a series of brutal atrocities remembered in Poland as the Deluge, and in right bank Ukraine it is known as the Ruin.
So this divide between East and West in Ukraine is still exists. So most Russian speakers are in the East. The West almost exclusively speaks Ukrainian.
This pivotal event would not only weaken the Commonwealth as a regional power, but also result in the creation of a Cossack hetmanate within the ironically far more heavy-handed rule of the Russian Tsars. And if you'd like to learn more about this period,
I
come
would!
check out my video on the Khmelnytsky uprising over on my channel Jabsy.
I will do that.
Now, basically from the onset of the uprising, the Cossacks were treated with a certain degree of suspicion by the Russians. They were all too happy to use them to defend against Tatar raids and even to aid them in their conquest of Siberia, but the Tsars knew all too well that a Cossack revolt could spell absolute disaster if they ever lost the hetmanate's favor. All the Cossacks wanted was independence, and Russia simply couldn't allow that to happen. Their fears were pretty well founded, as it turns out, since the Cossacks again switched sides in support of Sweden during the Great Northern War, but this time at the disastrous Battle of Poltava. The Cossack host was defeated, and from this point on, the seeds of malicious distrust in Ukraine had been sown. Russian control over the Cossacks, and Ruthenians in general, would slowly increase over time, accelerated by the partitions of Poland, where all of Ukraine, save for Galicia, found itself under Russian rule.
Yeah.
There was, of course, an added benefit.
And so that's a great power, Poland-Lithuania, being entirely split between Russia, obviously Austria and Prussia, so what is now Germany. It's crazy. It's like a great power just disappears from the map for hundreds of years.
To increase control over the Ruthenians, and that was because they stood between them and something the Russians deeply coveted, the Black Sea. From the 15th century onward, it was clear to the Russians that the only way to truly become a world power like those of Western Europe was through a large, powerful navy, but they lacked much in the way of seaports.
The Russians were desperate to acquire what they called a warm war support. So one which wouldn't freeze over in winter like some of their northern ones did. The one they really wanted was Constantinople, or Istanbul as it had now been renamed. But in the end, they had to make do with Crimea and Sevastopol.
This was one of the motivations behind the Northern Wars, after all, gaining control of the Baltic Sea. And it wasn't long before Russia started eyeing the Black Sea as well, inconveniently controlled by the Ottomans and the Tatars.
Yeah.
One Russo-Turkish war later.
And the story of the Tatars is very tragic, particularly their kind of later, more recent history. So they were hugely persecuted. I mean, there still are a lot of Tatars in Crimea, but they are a minority. They were horrendously both persecuted by Stalin. They were kind of expelled to Siberia, where many of them died. Some of them managed to make their way back at the end of the fall of the USSR. But yeah, it's a very sad history.
Later, Crimea was now easy pickings and annexed in 1783, just in case you thought Russia annexing Crimea was a new phenomenon.
Yes.
As with most of the territories acquired by the Russian Empire, Ukraine was heavily suppressed. Its Cossack hosts lost more and more of their autonomy, the Ruthenian language we now call Ukrainian was banned, and rebellions were violently put down. This was all part of a process known as Russification, and one of its largest proponents was Catherine the Great. Jews were especially...
So that's very important, because the Russian Empire expanded incredibly quickly. I mean, it went from being a large but not superpower sort of state in northeastern Europe to being a genuine hegemon right across Europe and Asia. And of course, as a result, they conquered a hell of a lot of different peoples, and they tried to turn them into Russians with varying degrees of success. So some, like the Finns, the Poles, some of the Central Asian peoples resisted very fiercely. Others allowed themselves to become Russified, and of course just became Russians, essentially.
Affected by these policies, restricted to stay in an area known as the Pale, in small, economically disadvantaged...
It's very sad, but just in world history, it's always the Jews who get screwed over. It's very sad.
...communities called the Shtetl, which greatly contributed to the suppression of Jewish culture. Now, although 19th century Russia was succeeding in the spreading of its internal power, the same cannot be said for its place on the world stage, and their intellectual control over Ruthenia would weaken due to several reasons. Firstly was the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas of self-determination during the French Revolution. Secondly, the revolutions of 1848. And thirdly, the very overt demonstration that Russia was not the invincible power it fancied itself, losing major world conflicts in the disastrous campaigns of the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War.
So the Crimean War was bad for Russia. It was a defeat, but they were fighting. I mean, they started a war against the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France came in to help the Ottoman Empire, but it was the Russo-Japanese War, which was just a total humiliation. It was a major European power being defeated by an Asian power, which at the time was seen as really, really unlikely. It was beginning, as we saw in my last video, of Japan's rise as a great power. But yeah, so I mean, military defeats play quite a big role in the downfall of Tsardom.
Exposed a weakness in the Tsarist regime that had stubbornly lacked reform and industrialization on the scale of other nations. It's not surprising then to see that Ukraine was at the ready to go its own way during the worst conflict Europe was to know at the time, at the outbreak of the First World War, the effects of which would lead to the Russian Civil War. It's worthwhile to remember that the Russian Civil War was by no means a monolith. It was a complicated network of ever-changing alliances, and this is no more evident...
I mean, that's an understatement. The Russian Civil War was chaos. I mean, the two main factions were the Bolsheviks, the Reds, the Communists, and the Whites, who were a kind of an alliance of different Russian nationalist factions. But there were tons of other groups. Lots of different national groups sought their own independence, including Ukraine. There were attempts... There were sort of green armies, peasant armies, who essentially would... all they wanted was to keep the Reds and the Whites off their lands, not to steal their crops. There were attempts to create anarchist states. It was complete chaos, complete carnage. It was a really, really brutal war.
Than in Ukraine, where it is remembered as the Ukrainian War for Independence, an independence they ultimately did not achieve. The anti-Bolshevik White Army allied with some of the Ukrainian nationalists, who in turn had allied with the Second Polish Republic. The Black Army had initially seized swathes of territory to form an anarcho-socialist society before eventually allying with the Bolshevik Reds. And the Bolsheviks even used Ukraine as a bargaining chip to seal a peace with Germany in 1918, but also with Poland in 1921.
So the 1921 war was actually very important between the USSR, as it had literally just become, and Poland. Because at the time there was real concern, or hope, I suppose, depending on your perspective, that Bolshevism would spread right across Europe. And it did in other places. Hungary had a Bolshevik revolution. Bavaria did briefly. It was later suppressed. Austria had a very strong presence of kind of Bolshevik aligned groups, as did Italy. So there was this real hope by the communists, fear from their opponents, for their ideology would roll right across Europe. And the Polish victory against the USSR was very important in stopping that. and they're therefore determining the politics of interwar Europe.
Which is where the borders were ultimately settled on again, splitting Ukraine in two. It was not until the Second World War that West Ukraine would be reunited by force.
Yes.
I've covered the history of the Soviet Union in a separate video, so I won't go into too much detail about this era here, but I do want to go over some important details in Ukraine's more contemporary development. The first was that of exploitation. Ukraine became a massive center of industrialization and natural resources in the Soviet era, making it a huge target for two of humanity's worst dictators. Not only Hitler during the invasion of the Soviet Union, but also the Soviets' own premier Joseph Stalin, whose land reforms would cause the Great Soviet Famine, known as the Holodomor, which led to the deaths of between 3 and 12 million Ukrainian peasants.
I mean, this was a famine right across the Russian Empire, but it was particularly intense in Ukraine. And there have always been people who've argued that it was partly used as a political weapon to destroy the Ukrainian people. That is, that Stalin deliberately made the famine worse for Ukraine to destroy Ukrainian national identity. I mean, and that's why some people consider it to have been a genocide.
A majority of the more than 2 million Soviet Jews who perished in the Holocaust were also from Ukraine, which erased almost all of its historical Jewish community. In Kiev alone, the SS killed more than 30,000 Jews in just 2 days during the infamous Babin Yar massacre.
I know there are always Jewish communities across what is now Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states. Very vibrant, thriving communities were just wiped out. It's horrendous what happened.
The second is more to do with Ukraine's current geopolitical standpoint, which I think is vital to understanding post-independence Ukraine, which has been in a push and pull in two directions directly linked to its unique geography. The vast open steppes are still envied by the Kremlin, who has lost one of its great buffer zones to NATO. Pro-Western leadership in this young nation has been hamstrung by Russian influence on more than one occasion. Russia wants Ukraine to be a quiet and stable ally, and they've actively supported pro-Russian separatists since 2014. The Dnieper River still forms the new...
So going back a little bit early, so in 2004 there was a contested Ukrainian election. So a pro-Russian candidate won, but it was widely regarded as a rigged election, and there were huge protests which resulted in a revote. Actually, the guy who was the pro-Western candidate got poisoned. It was very, very nasty, of course. Then in 2014, the second Ukrainian revolution happened, or the Maidan Revolution, after Ukraine tried to pull out of a deal it had made with the EU, or the Ukrainian government did. A kind of like economic cooperation agreement with the EU, which infuriated many of the Ukrainian people who saw it as a movement towards Russia. So that sparked huge protests in Kiev. The protesters were attacked violently, and eventually the violence spiraled. And some of what happened in Kiev was insane. So I mean, you can see videos. There's a really good Vice documentaries, because it's almost like medieval fighting. It's thousands of Ukrainian riot police with kind of riot shields, fighting with thousands of Ukrainian protesters, nationalists, with petrol bombs. And eventually the Ukrainian government was forced out, and then a new pro-Western government came in. And in retaliation, Russia tried to seize much of the east. They managed to get Donetsk and Luhansk, which are now they regard themselves as two independent states, but they're only recognised by Russia.
Nucleus of the nation, and a divide that has gone back centuries by influences from outside powers. The inhabitants on the east of this river are still more likely to identify as and to speak Russian.
I think I slightly disagree with this. I think they're more likely to speak Russian. I'm not so sure about identify as Russian. So, for example, Donetsk, which is now the capital of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, effectively under Russian control. Though in the 1991 referendum on Ukrainian independence, Donetsk voted very heavily in favour of Ukrainian independence. Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second city, is kind of also in the east, currently under siege, is resisting the Russians incredibly fiercely, despite being a Russian-speaking city. So I think the assumption that Russian-speaking means pro-Russian is a bit simplistic.
Thanks to centuries of oppression under the Tsars and the Soviet Union. And of course, the Black Sea is still as hotly contested as ever.
Yeah.
Fearing Ukraine,
I mean, it's now been shut by Turkey to Russian warships.
moving to closer ties with the European Union, and the rampant instability of the Ukrainian crisis, Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula to protect its Black Sea ports. The current Ukrainian crisis may feel new, but it's worth remembering that we're not at the end of Ukraine's story, nor are we ever. We're in the middle of its most recent chapter.
I mean, considering this was made 2 years ago, that is prescient as hell. That's some real foreshadowing there.
And conceptualizing its past may help with its future going forward.
Yeah, let's hope.
Thank you to today's sponsor, Raycon.
So that was really interesting. I learned a lot. I didn't realise the impact that kind of the original nomadic peoples had on Ukrainian identity. I certainly didn't appreciate the impact that Cossacks had. So that was new to me. I knew about the Viking influence and the kind of Kievan Rus, but some of the other stuff was really new to me. So that was fascinating. So obviously it's a very difficult topic at the moment. My thoughts are with the Ukrainian people for all the good they'll do, but I really do have you in my sympathies. But I hope you found that interesting. Obviously, it being a YouTuber, I should say like, comment, subscribe, and I hope to see you for the next video.